Maybe.
Our next speaker is Kaci Wei from the Ohio State University.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name's Kaci Wei, and I'm a current third-year veterinary student at Ohio State. And today I'll be discussing an evaluation of rectal and contactless infrared thermometers on body temperatures in lactating sows and differences in temperature locations. The objective of this study was to compare the gold standard traditional rectal thermometer temperature readings to contactless infrared temperatures. I also recorded the amount of time spent obtaining temperature and identified differences between devices and locations at both 24 hours and 48 hours post-farrowing. As an introduction, infrared technology may reveal quicker and more simplified locations to ascertain body temperatures. This is really important because we're constantly improving efficiency and production metrics in our sow herds, with some of our most prolific sow herds reaching 16 pigs born alive in these litters. Body temperature is a way to monitor our sows postpartum and potentially mitigate consequences of infection and illness in sows in the litter that it nurses. Currently, pyrexia is defined by a rectal temperature at 24 hours post-farrowing of greater than 102.7 degrees to 103.1 degrees Fahrenheit, or at 48 hours, a temperature greater than 102.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Currently, the biggest challenge, and one of the reasons why sow farms are not obtaining rectal temperatures, is because it's really time-consuming, especially with some of the labor shortages that we're facing right now in the industry. So for my study, it took place on a 2,500 head sow farm in the Midwestern USA, and I collected data for 7 days. This gave me a total of 70 sows for which I collected individual data on each sow, including a rectal temperature, an infrared contactless nasal temperature, and an infrared contactless perineal temperature. I also collected these temperatures at 24 hours and 48 hours for each sow, and I recorded the amount of time that it took me to obtain each temperature by each method. The materials used in this study included a standard 30-second digital thermometer of the Walgreens brand and a Braun no-touch and forehead thermometer, which was infrared, and I used that to collect the nasal and perineal infrared readings. So for the rectal temperature, I used just a standard method with the 30-second thermometer. The contactless perineal temperature, I actually, through some trial and error, was able to determine that by angling the thermometer at a 45-degree angle toward where the anus and vulva meet on the sow, and then directing it cranially towards the sow, I was able to come up with pretty consistent readings with the rectal thermometer. And for the contactless nasal, I scanned the dorsal medial part of the snout, and for both of the contactless temperatures, I held the thermometer less than 2 inches from the sow. So here are the results on the average time taken to collect and read temperature for each method. The red bar displays that on average, it took about 47.3 seconds per sow to obtain a rectal temperature reading. The contactless nasal method took about 19 seconds on average per sow, and the infrared perineal readings took about 7.3 seconds for each sow. This chart displays a comparison of rectal versus contactless perineal temperature readings. So for example, if we look at the first data point, it's going to be a 99 degree reading, degrees Fahrenheit reading for the perineal temperature, and this would then translate to a rectal temperature of about 100 degrees. I also wanted to note that rectal temperatures between 100 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the relationship between them was nearly linear, with an R2 value of 0.51 and a correlation of 0.79. This chart shows a comparison of observation day versus body temperature. So the main takeaway from this slide is that if a sow had a fever at 24 hours, it was very likely and strongly correlated that she would also have one at 48 hours. However, if a sow, that also correlates, so if a sow didn't have a fever, she would have one both days, but if she did have a fever at 24 hours, she would also have one at 48 hours. So a recommendation that can be taken from this is that since they're very strongly correlated, we could potentially reduce the amount of times we're temping sows and implement temping them at 24 hours. So this would lead to earlier mitigation for potential fever and disease and increase our chances of that sow recovering. Like all studies, there were some limitations within my trial. The first being that infrared thermometers do not do well when sprayed with urine, feces, or moisture. So for example, my nasal temperature readings weren't very consistent for a few reasons that I suspect, but one of them being that they would actually exhale into my thermometer and it would cause it to read an error, and it just wasn't very good for the nasal temperatures. Also, I found that not all infrared thermometers are created equally. I actually had to switch the model of infrared thermometer that I used because one absolutely wasn't consistent with any of the readings, but I did find this Braun one to be pretty accurate. And finally, infrared thermometers do need to be cleaned and stored in a case after use. So this is a limitation just because of the environment that temperatures are in on sow farms. It's really important that we get them cleaned and store them in a safe, clean area for them. So in conclusion, this study has major impacts on stewardship. Quicker and simpler sow monitoring methods can be implemented by using an infrared contactless thermometer. To have an example of the impact that the infrared thermometers can make on a sow farm, if I were to temperature sow farm, a 5,000 head sow farm, one time per week, I would be spending 3.5 hours a week rectal temping sows. And if I did this at 24 hours and 48 hours, I would be spending about 7 hours a week rectal temping sows. With the contactless perennial method, I would be spending 33 minutes a week or 66 minutes a week. This is a reduction in 84%, a reduction of time of 84% when comparing a rectal to a perennial contactless method. Not only is this study has a large impact on stewardship, but it also has a very a strong real-world application to it. There's an increasing need of efficiency for labor shortages that we face, and we're often diverting resources and time within our employees on the farm to collect temperatures. So this reduction in time could be really beneficial to sow farms moving forward. So another key takeaway is that the formula used to convert a contactless perennial method to a rectal temperature is the contactless perennial temperature plus 24.01 divided by 1.23. And this is a chart that kind of simplifies it down, for more basic use, and you could even hand it out on sow farms. So for example, if you get a reading on the contactless perennial method of 99, that's equivalent to a rectal temperature of about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. If we look at the end of the chart, a 102.5 degrees Fahrenheit on the contactless perennial would be equivalent to a 102.9 reading on a rectal thermometer. So it can be drawn that if you're getting a reading on a contactless perennial temperature of greater than 102.5, it suggests that an intervention or treatment is needed for that animal. I also do recommend that if you're going to implement this on your farms, to have producers just run a quick validation of their own, because like I said, there is some variance between different models of infrared thermometers. Finally, I would like to thank Dr. Juan Carlos and PIC for all of their guidance on this project, along with Dr. Jessica Higgins and Dr. Lynette Holman with Kalmbach Feeds. Thank you, and I'll now accept questions.
Questions for Kaci?
Great job, Kaci. One question is, did you look at multiple people taking those temperatures and if there was differences between the person taking that temp and the infrared reading?
So that's a really good question. She asked if I looked at different people taking those temperatures and seeing if there's differences in readings. For this study, I did not. I'm the only one that took temperatures just because I wanted to keep that consistent throughout this study. But I think that's a good thing to look at in the future.
Nice job, Kaci. Did you look at how you classified them in terms of when you classified them as having a fever with the rectal versus the other approaches?
Could you explain that? I guess could you ask that one more time?
So the goal was to classify them as having a fever, right? So did you look at how often you misclassified them with the perennial, the nasal, contactless temperature versus the rectal temperature?
Yeah, so looking at differences between classifying a sow as having a fever or not between methods. So the nasal method was very inaccurate, so I definitely would not recommend that. And I think that's for a few reasons, like one of them being if they get a drink of water, it might cool down their nose or something like that. As far as perennial, the perennial method caught fevers within sows on every single one except one, and it was only by, I want to say, less than half a degree difference.
Hi, nice presentation. Have you also checked for variance between seasons? For instance, in heat stress circumstances, could imagine you have a higher temperature of the surface compared to a more normal normal temperatures of the barn. Is this influenced?
So the question was if the different temperatures influence this study, like within the rooms. My study did take place during 1 week within the summer, so it was pretty warm outside. I didn't really do analysis on how that, I guess, contributed to differences of the thermometer readings in this study.
Any other questions? No? Thank you, Kaci.